You know, the history of science is filled with incredible stories, but this one is right near the top. It's about a single idea that would change the world. But it wasn't discovered just once. It was discovered twice by two different men on opposite sides of the planet at almost the exact same time. So let's get into how two totally different minds on two completely different journeys came up with the same revolutionary answer.
And that's the big question, isn't it? How does that even happen? We're talking about a time with no internet, no instant communication, just two guys, thousands of miles apart, observing the natural world. It's an amazing story about genius, sure, but also about circumstance, and how the planet itself leaves clues for anyone patient enough to piece them together.
Okay, so let's meet our two main characters. On the left, you've got Charles Darwin. He came from a pretty wealthy, well-connected family. And on the right, Alfred Russel Wallace. A brilliant guy, but he came from a much more modest background and really had to work and hustle for a living. They were inspired by some of the same books, but the paths they took to discovery couldn't have been more different. All because of two epic and very separate journeys.
To really get how they both landed on the same idea, we've got to look at the incredible voyages they took. These weren't just pleasure cruises. These trips were the entire basis for their work, providing the raw data and the inspiration that would turn science on its head.
So, first up is Darwin. He gets this amazing opportunity to be the naturalist on a Royal Navy ship, the HMS Beagle. And this trip was absolutely massive. We're talking 5 years circumnavigating the globe, covering a staggering 64,000 kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's more than 1.5 times around the Earth. And he spent most of his time in the cooler, temperate parts of the southern hemisphere.
Then you have Wallace. His expedition was a totally different beast. No fancy government-funded ship for him. This was a commercial trip. He was paying his own way. He actually spent more time out there, a whole 8 years, but covered less ground. He did a deep dive, focusing intensely on island hopping through the hot, humid tropics of the Malay archipelago, which is basically modern-day Indonesia.
I mean, when you put them side by side like this, the differences are just so clear. Darwin's on a 5-year global tour with the full backing of the British Navy. Wallace is grinding it out for 8 years on his own dime in one specific tropical region. You can already start to imagine how these completely different sets of circumstances are going to shape the kind of evidence each of them found.
So yeah, their journeys were different, but so are their methods. The way they actually collected specimens was miles apart. And this is absolutely key, because these distinct approaches are what led them down strangely parallel paths to the same mind-blowing conclusion.
Darwin, as the official ship's naturalist, was like a kid in a candy shop. He was collecting a little bit of everything. Plants, cool rocks, fossils, you name it. He wasn't in it for the money, so he'd usually just grab a male and a female of a species and move on. But Wallace had bills to pay. He had to collect things he could actually sell to museums and private collectors back in Europe. So he focused on the things that sold well: stunning beetles, exotic butterflies, and rare birds. And this is so important. It meant he collected in huge numbers, not just one or two, but hundreds, even thousands of the same type of animal. This gave him an incredibly deep understanding of just how much a single species could vary.
And you can hear it straight from the man himself. This quote from Wallace really says it all. He's basically like, look, I'd love to collect plants, but they don't sell. It just perfectly captures his reality. He was a scientist, absolutely, but he was also a working man. That financial pressure forced him to specialize in a way that Darwin never had to.
Both men were totally fascinated by the massive differences they saw between the animals of Asia and Australia. When Darwin got to Australia, he was just floored by the kangaroos and all the other marsupials. They were so utterly alien compared to what he'd seen everywhere else. He even wrote that it felt like the work of two distinct creators. I mean, for that time, that was a pretty radical thing to think, and it really started to challenge that idea of a single, unified creation.
So Darwin sensed this divide. But Wallace, he went a step further. He found it. Because he was so focused on that one region, island hopping for years, he didn't just have a hunch there were two different worlds. He could pinpoint the exact invisible line on the map where the animal kingdom of Asia stopped and the animal kingdom of Australia began.
And that boundary is now famously known as Wallace's Line. And what is absolutely wild is how sharp this line is. It runs between two islands, Bali and Lombok, which are only 24 kilometers apart. You can practically see one from the other. On the Bali side, you get Asian animals like woodpeckers and monkeys. You cross that tiny stretch of water, and boom, you're in a different world. Now you've got Australian-type fauna, like cockatoos. It's like walking through a door into another biological continent.
So what was going on? Wallace had this brilliant geological insight. He figured that during the ice ages, sea levels were much, much lower. So all the islands on the Asian side of his line were actually connected by land bridges. Animals could just walk from one to the other. But, and this is the genius part, there was always a deep ocean trench right between Bali and Lombok. That trench never dried up. So the Asian animals could walk all the way to Bali, but they could never cross that deep water channel to get to Lombok.
So at this point, both men had collected all these puzzle pieces. They knew that species change over time, and they could see that geography was a huge factor. But they were both missing the big one, the mechanism. What was the engine actually driving all this change? Well, this is where their separate journeys finally converge on the same incredible idea. For Wallace, the final piece of the puzzle came in a flash of inspiration during a pretty rough time. He was on the island of Ternate suffering from a terrible bout of malaria, and in this feverish state, he suddenly remembered reading about the economist Thomas Malthus and his idea of the struggle for existence among humans. And it just clicked. He realized that same struggle applied to all of nature. The animals with some tiny variation that gave them an edge would survive and pass it on. The ones without it wouldn't. Just like that, in a fever dream, he had figured out natural selection.
And this is where the story gets really dramatic. It's February 1858. Wallace writes up his theory and mails it to the one person he knows will understand its importance, Charles Darwin. The crazy thing is, Wallace has no idea that Darwin has been secretly working on this exact same theory for 20 years. Darwin gets the letter and is totally shocked. His life's work, and this guy in the jungle just figured it out? Well, to avoid a huge scientific controversy, their friends arranged for a joint Darwin-Wallace paper to be presented a few months later. Then, Darwin finally lit a fire under himself and rushed to publish his masterpiece, On the Origin of Species, the very next year.
And so, they're forever linked in history as the co-discoverers of evolution by natural selection. But their story doesn't just end there with a nice, neat bow. Their shared legacy is actually a lot more complex, full of mutual respect for sure, but also some pretty major disagreements down the line.
Now, they always agreed on the big stuff: natural selection, common ancestry, the evidence from fossils, all the core principles. But they definitely argued about some of the finer points. Darwin, for instance, thought sexual selection, like a peacock's tail evolving just to attract mates, was a huge deal. Wallace, not so much. And their biggest disagreement was over the human mind. Wallace eventually came to believe that our complex consciousness couldn't be explained by natural selection alone.
But here's the ultimate takeaway. Their incredible theories weren't just pulled out of thin air. They were built on years of hard evidence that they collected themselves on these life-changing journeys. It's funny, Darwin really had his eureka moment years after his voyage was over, sitting at home poring over his notes. Wallace had his right there in the field. But in the end, their separate paths led them to the same revolutionary place, and together they laid the foundation for all of modern biology.
And it all leaves you with this one last thing to think about. The story of Darwin and Wallace really has elements of a race, a competition to be first, but it also has moments of deep respect and collaboration. So, what does that tell us about science itself? What's the real engine of discovery? Is it competition or is it collaboration?